podcast for potential development by and with Uli Vogel. A warm welcome, dear listeners, to a new episode of our podcast. And today, I'm especially proud to share who I've managed to bring on as a guest for our podcast. It's Dr. Maria Schoiswohl from Kommhaus in Bad Aussee. Maria, I'm truly delighted to have you here.
Uli, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really glad that we get to talk today.
That's wonderful. Maria, how do I know you? Well, I know you through your father, Martin, whom I met in 2011 and who, sadly, passed away far too soon in 2020. We were friends and also worked together a great deal. I actually met you back in the 2010s. We've seen each other here and there. Who are you for our listeners? Just briefly. You studied journalism at the University of Vienna, did your journalist training as well, and you've worked for a long time as a freelance journalist, book author, editor-in-chief, and photographer. And also, you've worked a lot in the field of aesthetics, being multi-talented. You've always worked for Kommhaus, since 2000, editorially since 2017, then fully got involved in all areas, and it was planned for you to take over management, which you did in 2020. Took it over completely. And now I've mentioned Kommhaus a few times already. Of course, as a listener, you might be thinking, yeah, that's probably something along the lines of communications consulting. Well, yes and no. You folks are definitely something special, in my opinion. I've had the pleasure of knowing you for 13 years now, and we've done a lot together. So, what exactly is Kommhaus, and what makes it so special? Maybe we should just dive right in.
That's a wonderful idea. So, what is Kommhaus? We're a consulting agency. We've been around for more than 30 years now, and we have two main areas of focus. One is strategic consulting in the areas of employer branding, brand positioning, change management, and transformation management. But then there's also the second point. Communications work, where we actually operate across the entire internal and external communications spectrum for our clients. We break that down a bit further into design. That means we do a lot in the analog space as well, like printed materials that can be a bit out of the ordinary, but also in the digital realm. And then there's the topic of know-how, where we focus on knowledge transfer, on the one hand through workshops and seminars, but also through targeted trend research for our clients.
So that means you basically train them as well, in a certain way, if I understand correctly.
That's right. We encourage dialogue and our clients' communication skills. You can see that things have changed a bit these days. We all know what it's like when we use our smartphones a lot or other digital media. It's actually smart to know how to talk to each other, too.
Yes, very nice. You really have to go back to basics here and keep the hands-on work alive. It's always about finding the right mix, but also having that in-person presence, which, as we know since the pandemic, is something special that maybe we used to take for granted and didn't really appreciate. But it also needs to be done properly and well. Back then, you also took on a lot of design work for us. In the other area, we didn't do as much back then. But let's quickly switch back to strategy for a moment. Let's pivot. How should I picture that? You folks are really strong in that area. You're deeply rooted in the region. I know that, but Martin has always told me that you also do work for German clients and sometimes even abroad, here and there. So what's a typical case where you say, all right, now we really need to take a strategic approach here? What comes to mind for you?
Typical is kind of relative because we deal with very individual cases. We work with everyone from sole proprietors to large corporations. Most of the time, it's through various clients who then approach us. That's a big advantage. We also have a strong network. But it's about things like, say, a long-standing metalworking company, a metal shop, for example, where the next generation has just taken over the leadership. And then it's about putting the company to the test again with the new generation now in charge. Are the business areas the right ones? Are the employees the right fit? Is our public image appropriate? Where do we need to make adjustments, so to speak, so that we develop in the way the next generation wants? That's one example.
So, if I may just jump in, it's about creating coherence again for the new era, bringing all those factors back into alignment. And not just, as you might think. With communications consulting, we don't just look at the text or the website, but you see it in a more holistic way. Am I saying that right?
Absolutely. We get involved in organizational development and do it in a very needs-based way, wherever there's a pinch or a problem, or wherever it's needed. We also bring in our outside perspective and expertise, since we work in a variety of sectors, industry, tourism, retail, and also scientific companies that we support. That means, or scientific organizations, we can bring a lot of experience to the table there. And that's a bit of a holistic view of the company, which as an entrepreneur you often don't really have yourself. And that's very helpful for our clients.
Which also means, with the variety of industries you mentioned, that it really broadens your perspective. For these companies, which, as we know, and not just companies but entire industries, are often operating with blinders on, only looking inward.
Absolutely. So that's one of our, how should I put it, core competencies, broadening horizons and thinking holistically with foresight. We then bring in experiences from the tourism sector that can suddenly be useful in an industrial company. That's always very enriching for our clients.
That sounds exciting, but now I've interrupted you. After the first example about succession and coherence. But you wanted to move right on to the next step. Towards, what are the strategic things?
Exactly. So we also support companies that are just starting out, basically startups, where we look together at how they want to, or can, position themselves in the market. We then do classic market research with them, conduct opinion surveys, see where we stand, do analyses, and then plan together with the owners how they want to structure themselves organizationally, how they want to organize themselves, and of course, how to communicate this externally through marketing or internally in the area of employee communication. That means it's very structured and very holistic.
If I may jump in here, I've also had my own experience with that, and it was good. Back in 2011, I wasn't quite there yet. I had already been around for 2 years since 2009, but a lot of it was self-made. And back then, Martin, your father, I can't quite remember what the program was called, but it was something with enterprise.
Vision.
Enterprise. That's right. That really helped me a lot. Maybe you could say a couple of sentences about that as well, if you like. Not just research for startups and the like, as you just mentioned, but when things are already a bit further along, when the company is up and running, what becomes important then?
Well, putting yourself to the test and always questioning things critically because, of course, you have a certain business idea that is successful for a while, but as a company, if you really want to stay ahead, you always have to keep changing it. And Vision Enterprise basically puts you to the test, as I mentioned with those first steps, and then works with you to develop your purpose, that is, your company philosophy, and also says, okay, with the involvement of your employees. We always say you have to include those affected as well because they're the ones who have to carry the company forward, so where do we really want to go? And then we set very concrete goals and measures. In a process that takes a maximum of 3 months. And then you basically have your roadmap again, which you can confidently use to move into the future, especially in times when a lot of conditions can change very quickly, when you know you have to stay flexible. But still, you have a plan.
Yeah, I remember quite well that back then, the company values for us were worked out, and they're still valid to this day. So, they are individuality, which we see as very important here. Of course, at Profiling Values, it's in the nature of what we do, since we deal with people's potential. Then there was trust, which came out as well, so that people can open up. Of course, the individual needs trust. Then it was about giving people orientation, that was the third value. And finally, we do this very competently, so competence was the fourth value. And finally, we do this with precision, using very, very precise tools, and that still holds true today. In my opinion, it was worked out in a very clear and convincing way, and that actually brings me to our second point: how do we actually connect the topic of values with the topic of communication? And you're the specialist, so I'm really glad that I can connect the topic of values with you today. Some time ago, you started a newsletter series where you dedicated yourselves to different values. Maybe we can talk about one or two of them right away. But what was the intention behind that? How did you come up with the idea to really focus on this as
Kommhaus. To address the topic of values so explicitly. Basically, it's naturally a part of our Vision Enterprise process, where we also analyze brands. That's called profiling brands. It's similar, so to speak, to profiling values exactly, and that's where you get an initial setting. What values are embedded within a company, and what's interesting is, we work with a lot of different clients, and the worlds of values are always different. Always completely individual. And yet, these values are naturally what connect the employees, the clients, the entire universe of the company, so to speak. Define them. We ourselves have our own triad of values, which essentially includes uniqueness, determination, and success. And some time ago we said, yes, the topic of values is becoming more and more important in our society. And we're using our platform to highlight this and to introduce values that also have a certain value, of course, that's a bit of a play on words now, for the company or for entrepreneurs. And, for example, the last newsletter dealt with the topic of tolerance, because we see it as very relevant to society, not just in society, but also in every company, since we work with many individualists. Individualism is even more important among employees now than it was a few years ago. And so, it's simply a matter of being tolerant. And how can you deal with that? But we also picked up on the topic of pragmatism, especially in reference to, as we know, the baby boomers. I have a lot of respect for that generation. They're extremely pragmatic by nature. And we highlighted the real value and significance that older employees bring to a company as well. And so we always pick out one topic or another that we see is currently relevant. And we look at what tips we can give our clients about it.
Now I'll ask the expert right away how it actually went. Did you say right from the start, okay, now we'll make an editorial plan for this. Let's think about which values are important here. And we'll plan all of that in advance. Or is it a bit more dynamic for you? You just mentioned maybe having a current relevance. Does it follow a certain system now? Or is it simply that we have it on our radar now, that this is, of course, our newsletter series, and we fill it, and then we've got our sensors out for it as well?
The most important thing in communication is consistency. That means we know we want to say something about it once a month and already have a certain idea of the direction we want to go, but we really stick to current events. Right now, in Austria, there are quite a few elections coming up. Here too, the topic of tolerance was definitely an appealing one, to say, yes, there are many different political opinions, and ideally, those should be allowed as well. But you have to keep the discussion open and be able to tolerate that someone else has a different opinion. Yes, that's also the case in everyday business life, if I, so to speak, match up with a colleague and pitch an idea.
Whether
that's good or bad is beside the point, but you have to show that kind of tolerance. So yes, we tend to go with what's current, you know. But once a month, there should be a reminder about which value is important for your company.
Yes, so anyone who does this professionally knows about this regularity, about how important it is to be consistent. Even for us on our social media and so on, anyone who does this professionally has to plan ahead a bit. On the other hand, you also have to be flexible as well. I also really like working with bipolar concepts, meaning pairs of values. You just picked out tolerance as an example, which is a good one. That's something that's currently being discussed in your country. Of course, on the other side, there's also conflict, which is a value as well. And no matter which value you choose, at the end of the day, communication is always involved, because as we know from Paul Watzlawick, you can't not
communicate.
And if we take a look at the pair of values, tolerance and conflict more or less arises on its own in companies. With tolerance, you can give it a bit of a push, which is what you do as well. And that's an area where we can continue to grow. But now, what's your take? Conflict and communication, just off the cuff. None of this is prearranged. Here. What role does communication play, and what should you maybe pay attention to?
Now, specifically in relation to conflicts. Yeah. Like you said, conflicts happen on their own. But in reality, when planning communication, you should also try to anticipate what conflicts certain topics might trigger. That's one thing, but when you're already entering into a conflict conversation, or I say conversation because, ideally, you really should handle these things in person. Then it's important to speak to each other as equals, to use certain methods, mechanisms, and questions, ways to phrase things that can help de-escalate the situation. It takes a bit of forethought and awareness, which means very mindful communication. I really like the topic of mindfulness, but I have to say, it's starting to get a bit overused. In reality, it's about going into a conflict conversation openly, a bit like the Harvard principle, how you approach negotiations, open to an outcome.
Yeah, that's good.
And ideally, not letting it get to the point where things are so stuck that you can't even talk to each other anymore. Yeah.
So, maybe for those who aren't familiar with the Harvard principle, it's not about talking from positions, but rather about the interests behind them, so that you can come together on a higher level. Of course, I just brought up conflict here in the most general sense, as opposed to tolerance. And you quite rightly made that association. That these are conflicts that also exist on a personal level. And then it's absolutely right to de-escalate and so on in a one-on-one conversation. But if we now look at conflict in a positive light, and maybe also bring communication into the mix, because for me, and as Jim Collins always puts it quite well, we actually need to rub up against each other in a company, or, to put it in sporting terms, wrestle for the best solution. And for that, conflicts are necessary, not personal ones, but rather conflicts of interest, and even positional conflicts. When it comes to the content, to the factual matters here as well. Outwardly, of course, we all have to sing from the same song sheet, and there shouldn't be even a sheet of paper between us anymore. But this internal wrestling, this striving for it. What can, for the best solution? What communication tips might help with that, or what is important in communication in this context? Because we also know the other side, the conflict avoidance, this. We sweep everything under the rug and so on, which also leads to negative outcomes. So, I'm just going to throw you into a situation that I'm imagining right now. But I think that's exactly the point, that we discuss things like this live. That's why I'm tossing the ball over to you now. How do you perceive the situation and what thoughts come to mind?
Conflict in companies is actually something very positive because, as you already said, people need to be able to rub up against each other, otherwise nothing new will come about. We have a good example from a long-standing client who, for years, had anchored harmony in their value system and lived it out very explicitly. But that led to a noticeable sense of sluggishness, because they tried to avoid each and every potential conflict instead of actually confronting and facing a discussion for the sake of finding a solution. And simply saying, okay, let's move forward. We are of completely different opinions, and we have to hash it out now so we can come up with a good new solution. Harmony then actually dropped out of their list of values during a process. So to speak, it dropped out of their set of values. Which wasn't a negative thing. In fact, they put a positive spin on it, saying, we need to move forward more courageously, and then they adopted a different value. At that time, it was consistency, and later on, they also included openness. So they said they needed to face the sluggishness because otherwise there would be stagnation. And what we're already seeing is that this also has a bit to do with generational communication, that younger generations prefer to avoid conflicts. And they younger generations tend to avoid conflicts and try to resolve misunderstandings through third parties. That means they don't tell you directly to your face if they disagree with something. This is often the case with apprentices. They don't address it directly, but communicate it through third or even fourth parties. And there's research on youth. Mr. Heinzelmeier regularly conducts some very interesting studies here in Austria. He's also noticed a certain trend developing, a tendency towards a culture of sneakiness. It's really sad to see, especially among young people, because it would make so much sense to address things directly with each other in order to move forward together. Conflict isn't actually a bad thing. In reality, it just takes the art of dialogue and discussion, a certain culture of how to interact with each other to make progress.
It's not just about resolving the conflict, as
Mr.
Hartspringer nicely puts it. Sometimes the conflict itself is the solution, so you have to look at it
from that perspective.
I think calling it deviousness is a bit much in this context. So, I'm just going to take it as it resonates with me, because I don't actually think that the intention of these young people is necessarily deviousness. They don't even have the capacity for that. It's more like they're just taking the path of least resistance. Slash.
Exactly.
It's like, well, if I can't bring it up there, if I don't want to bring it up there, then I'll just bring it up somewhere else. And then, of course, we end up facing the issue that, in company communication, is a total disaster. We stop talking to each other and start talking about each other.
About each other, exactly.
And then we talk about each other in such a way that the person being talked about can't even stand next to us anymore. Yeah, because that's always my golden rule. I only talk about others in a way that they could stand right there with me. Of course, that's not always so easy. Because sometimes you do have a bit of a tendency to gossip. Humanity as a whole does, really. But it should be a guiding principle, at least somewhere. And in that sense, I find what you're saying about young people really interesting. But where does it come from, then? Because, in quotation marks, people communicate much more passively through devices. Otherwise, if I'm in person, I'd have to walk away or I'd be standing right next to the person. But with devices, I can just switch off. Or how do you explain that?
Certainly because of the new or different use of media that has become part of our lives. There are also studies on this that say younger people don't really like talking on the phone anymore, or only if you let them know in advance that you're going to call, ideally, because they don't want to react spontaneously to something, but would rather be prepared. And that certainly has something to do with the pandemic, which of course had a bit of an influence. Because our communication habits suddenly had to change, or in some cases, had to be completely adjusted. And as I said, also because of smartphones, tablets, and so on. A lot of people prefer to communicate in writing. Using the various messaging apps we have, rather than just making a quick phone call to sort things out faster. Yeah.
But maybe we should also look at the other side now. You're talking about the younger generation. My dad is turning 90 this year, so are my parents. When the phone rings for them, that's mandatory, so to speak, it's mandatory, as you'd say in English. No matter what, you answer it. And those were things, when I was a kid and so on, the idea of ignoring the phone just never even crossed your mind. Someone was trying to reach me, and I just had it on silent again, because I usually keep it on silent, and to him, that's completely incomprehensible. And if I look at my Fiona now, one of my twin daughters, who also says, I don't like just being called out of the blue, then of course there are already shifts in communication. So I ask myself, when we have different generations in the company, how do we manage to get along? And then we're talking about tolerance, right?
Absolutely, because every generation has its own customs, so to speak, and you have to be able to accept those. You can't really change people after a certain age anyway, but even with younger people, all you can say is, okay, there are just all sorts of different ways still. And you also have to explain to the older ones that there are all sorts of different ways. Let's see if we can still find a common channel where we can connect with each other.
So, now we've actually already reached the latest developments. We used the example in communication, what the younger generation tends to prefer and what consequences that has. Let's take another look at that right at the end. Let's also take a look at the communications consulting market. How is it developing? You've been here for quite some time now. Also in a leadership role and in a strategic position at the Kommhaus. What are some of the trends in the communications consulting market? Or maybe even more broadly in communications that might interest our listeners?
A big topic is definitely AI, which has really made a strong impact for us this year. Although I have to say, AI is exciting, but it still can't do as much as humans can. So I'm a fan of HI, human intelligence, simply because, to be honest, when it comes to saying I need a good prompt, a good briefing for generating text, for example, it takes so many rounds that the robot or the machine needs to know what I actually want, and at that point, I'd still rather give it to someone who really writes text. They're usually much, much faster anyway. But of course, it's something that's coming and something you have to embrace as support. Even when it comes to conceptual work, it definitely makes sense. In the area of graphic design, it helps here and there, but I see it as a tool that basically supports me in my work. But that's only one part. What's definitely even more intense is the topic of employee communication, because here you have to address, as we mentioned earlier, individual personalities even more. You have to reach them across various channels as well, to get your messages across and make sure they actually get through. And many tend to say, let's move everything into the digital space because we have the internet or, so to speak, our social media channels. That's good, but it's only a piece of the pie. You really have to focus on personal encounters as well. I believe that in the future this will become even more important, even more exclusive and valuable, when you can sit face to face and work or discuss things together. That's something we always keep in mind in consulting. Let's not forget it. Not everything can happen digitally. Otherwise, it's really about the fact that, due to the economic situation, companies have, of course, scaled back their communication activities in some cases. Where I say, especially now, it's important to invest in communication, in marketing, in information. Also for your employees, because people need security. They need to know what's happening in the company, how we're developing further. So that, in a sense, the future can also be shaped. And you can't leave people behind when you say, okay, we have to deal with other strategic issues, especially now, in these partial crisis situations. You can see it, in some cases, a lot of employees are being let go or many companies are affected. All of a sudden, you get the feeling that things are being restructured out of the blue, and I don't understand how these situations can come about. But that's also related to a different aspect of corporate strategic development. And especially in those moments, it's absolutely crucial to communicate with people. And really, nothing has fundamentally changed about the fact that you have to communicate regularly. It's simply that you have to use more channels, and you have to use them a bit more individually as well, in order to reach all your dialogue groups. But it will always come down to the fact that we can't not communicate, but we mustn't stop communicating. Until next time. The worst thing you can do.
That's a great way to put it, and you're really the one who connects and integrates communication on the other side. Also, a plea for being present. There's really nothing more to add after that. Maria, thank you so much for your valuable time and for the contributions you made to our lively conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uli.
All right, see you very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.